For the longest time, my favourite game on the Xbox One was Ori and the Blind Forest. On top of being a top-notch Metroidvania, the game's visuals and audio design were just absolutely breathtaking, so obviously I went into its sequel, Ori and the Will of the Wisps, with particularly high expectations. However, Ori and the Will of the Wisps is actually pretty different from what I was expecting, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. The differences between Ori 1 and 2 aren't small either. We're talking about sweeping changes to combat, how the game treats its abilities, and even how checkpoints are handled. The most noticeable shift, for me at least, was how much more varied and exciting the game's combat is. Unlike the previous game, which gave you a little sprite that would shoot nearby enemies as you mashed the attack button, Will of the Wisps adds a fairly wide variety of weapons into the fray. It starts with a straightforward slashing attack, but very quickly lets players get their hands on heavy and ranged options among many others. In terms of actually fighting enemies, the game provides a much more satisfying experience, as attacks land with a tangible weight and power. It honestly feels a little like Hollow Knight, and the similarities to that game don't stop here. For example, the previous Ori game treated power-ups as most Metroidvania games do, by locking areas off behind traversal abilities, and while Will of the Wisps still does this, it also offers a surprising number of minor abilities that can be equipped as shards. These shards can give players a wide variety of benefits, from defensive and offensive boosts, the ability to crawl on walls, and even a triple jump if you want it. If you haven't made the connection, these are essentially charms from Hollow Knight. They give players a tangible sense of customization, but I personally didn't find many shards that were worth swapping out for. Once I found a handful that I liked, I don't think I ever changed them past my first few hours with the game. That said, others might find the system a little more interesting. Your mileage will vary. But for me, it was an inoffensive, if ineffectual, change to the formula from Ori and the Blind Forest. But the changes to Ori and the Blind Forest's formula for Will of the Wisps don't stop there. One of the big features of the original was that it let you spend energy to create checkpoints, a novel idea that would sort of let players set their own difficulty in a way. Instead of that, Ori and the Will of the Wisps relies on an autosave, which is fine. It's totally fine, it's just kind of standard, you know? My only real gameplay related gripe with this change, beyond it being kinda boring, is that the game still doesn't give you any checkpoints in the middle of its platforming gauntlets where the game's difficulty tends to ramp up, but more on that later I guess. Platforming gauntlets aside, as far as autosaves go, Ori and the Will of the Wisps is fairly generous, which is a little surprising considering the other notable changes made for this sequel. For as much as the game wants to be more like Hollow Knight, it certainly doesn't have its ruthlessness. Between regular checkpoints and the ability to change your abilities whenever you feel like it, the game can feel like a bit of a cakewalk. It still has some challenging sequences in its newly added boss fights and the aforementioned gauntlets, but for the most part the game is lacking in the difficulty department. But then, Ori and the Blind Forest wasn't necessarily the hardest game either, so fans of the original are likely to find a comparable level of difficulty here. They'll also find the same fast, ability-based platforming that made the original so satisfying to play. Piloting Ori feels just as responsive as it ever did, and the little sprite still has a number of cool abilities to combine during both puzzle and platforming sections. We're talking double jumps, we're talking wall jumps, we're talking launching yourself off of enemies and enemy projectiles to reach higher heights. Granted, there aren't a ton of brand new abilities to gain as far as traversal goes, but all of the classics are back, and they still feel just as good to pull off as they did for the first time 5 years ago. Honestly though, there are only one or two really good new abilities that I can think of in Ori and the Will of the Wisps, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little disappointed in that regard. Despite the game's reliance on legacy traversal skills, they still shine brightest during the platforming gauntlets that I mentioned earlier. These mad dashes through dangerous stretches of level that usually cap off the exploration of an area. These sequences are still really exciting, and for my money at least, the gauntlets in Will of the Wisps telegraph the paths that you need to take a little bit better than in the previous game. In Ori and the Blind Forest, I found that you need to try and fail each gauntlet a few times to really see where you needed to go, but this time around it was a little clearer on each initial attempt. It still would have been nice to have mid-sequence checkpoints, but since Will of the Wisps manages to convey the path forward a little bit better, their absence isn't as frustrating as it was previously. Alongside these moments as the game's tougher sections are boss fights, which the first game had none of. These encounters are genuinely terrifying thanks to some fantastic creature design, and though they typically follow a familiar three-phase structure, these phases are often broken up with mini-platforming gauntlets, and more often than not they get mid-battle checkpoints. On the whole, I really do enjoy the game's boss encounters, and they, alongside the gauntlet sequences, serve to break up the slower, exploration-focused majority of the game really well. And that slower exploratory part of the game is super enjoyable though, thanks in large part to the game's overall presentation. Ori and the Will of the Wisps is gorgeous, with vivid splashes of colour alongside more mellow, soft tones, and it has a variety of areas to explore. We're talking about serene forests, snow-capped peaks, sandy deserts, and everything in between. I don't think it's much of an exaggeration to say that almost every screen could pass off as a painting. Coupled with a soundtrack that lends an ethereal quality to the game's slower moments while still able to turn up the epic bombast during the more exciting sequences, Ori and the Will of the Wisps manages to rival the original in terms of its visual and audio quality. With that said though, Will of the Wisps does have a handful of technical issues that hamstring its presentation a little bit. The constant autosaving plagued my run with relentless hitching and stuttering, and some shots, especially close-ups on character models, lacked a certain sharpness which I found to be pretty distracting. Also, the game did crash on me 2 or 3 times. This could all be a side effect of playing the game on a launch Xbox One, but having played Ori and the Blind Forest literally hours before I played Will of the Wisps on the same console, I can't see why this game runs so much worse than the original. If it does indeed look better than the Blind Forest, then the difference is negligible, but the minor technical hiccups I ran into were very noticeable. My recommendation if you're looking to play this is to play it on an Xbox One X or even better a PC, but going off of a little research, it would seem that these issues aren't necessarily specific to my situation. Despite these annoyances, my time with the game was mostly really positive, and a large part of that was thanks to Will of the Wisps' narrative. It follows on from the events of Ori and the Blind Forest, with Ori's family growing to include the recently hatched owlet, Ku. During a flying lesson, Ku and Ori are blown far from home and separated from one another, trapped in an unfamiliar forest suffering from a magical decay after this land's spirit tree was destroyed. While the main goal of Restore the Spirit Tree is practically lifted from the first game, the addition of precious baby bird Ku and the quest to find her was honestly pretty gripping. Moon Studios are so fantastic at conveying emotion without spoken language, or at least without language that you can understand without subtitles, and Ori and the Will of the Wisps had me tearing up one minute and smiling from ear to ear the next. Much like its predecessor, Will of the Wisps is an emotional rollercoaster, but it's one that I'm looking forward to experiencing time and time again. If you're more of the one-and-done type of player though, Ori and the Will of the Wisps has plenty of additional content to tackle in a single run. Most of it simply rewards players with currency to buy and upgrade minor skills and abilities, but a lot of the side quests involve really clever puzzles or really challenging platforming and combat rooms, and completing this stuff is almost an end unto itself. It's a bit of a shame that you can't carry over any of the minor skills into a New Game Plus mode, but if you're a completionist then the game offers plenty to sink your teeth into. Ori and the Will of the Wisps is excellent. Although its technical issues were rather frustrating for me, there was so much to enjoy about Ori and the Will of the Wisps that they weren't enough to ruin my experience. The game's more complex approach to combat is a vast improvement over that of the original. The addition of boss fights added a new and exciting contrast to the usually laid-back exploration, and like its predecessor, the game looks and sounds magnificent. Now, I do wish there was a little more focus on what made the original game so much fun, like interesting traversal skills, and the game's imitation of Hollow Knight didn't really do much for me personally, but I wouldn't call these knocks against Ori and the Will of the Wisps. I would just say that it results in a game that's just as good as the original, but in a surprising and different way. I think fans of the original will still love it, even if it is a little different to what they might be expecting.